Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behavior nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behavior geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behavior nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. Once part of the ATA tribe, you'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behavior geeks. But we will get started on today's episode where we will be talking to one Dr. Gregory Hanley. Dr. Hanley has been applying the principles of learning to improve socially important behaviours of children and adults with and without disabilities for 30 years. Dr. Hanley is a Fellow of the American Psychological Association, Division 25, past Associate Editor of the Behaviour Analysis, and past Editor of the Behaviour Analysis in Practice and of the Journal of Applied Behaviour Analysis. He's published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, primarily focused on the assessment, treatment, and prevention of problem behavior and sleep problems and empirically derived values for practitioners. We're not washing his hands or thinking about his next meal. Dr. Hanley advises doctoral candidates as a research professor at WNEU, serves as an adjunct professor of the psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, and leads FTF Behavior, an international training and consulting group based in Worcester, Massachusetts. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Greg to the show today, who is patiently waiting by. Greg, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to hang out with us here at Animal Training Academy. It's very appreciated.
Well, thanks for having me, Ryan. I've heard a lot of nice things about your work and your podcasts from another Ryan in America, and got a chance to listen to some and enjoyed them thoroughly, especially the compilation you recently put together, which was some animal trainers talking about their emphases for the future, and I really, really enjoyed it. So it's very cool to be here.
Awesome. Well, that means a lot coming from you and all of the things that you've managed to achieve in your career and the great ripples that you put out into the behaviour world. So thank you very much for saying all of that. Let's dive straight in, Greg. Could you please take the listeners back and build on your bio we just read out and share where you first got started with applied behaviour analysis? We love stories here on the show, so feel free to share any pivotal moments in your career.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Like most people, I fell accidentally into behavior analysis, knowing at this point, or maybe at this point, a few people are, but in the not so distant past, no one grew up saying they wanted to be a behavior analyst. I always wanted to be a medical doctor. So as a kid, my parents used to make fun of me for constantly bandaging up all my stuffed animals, and that was something I did apparently as a young guy. But it never left me, and so I went to study pre-med and biology, but I wasn't much of a student. I was a little immature, and I drank a little too much, socialized a fair amount, played rugby too many hours, and did not attend to my studies. And so I was on the wrong end of the distribution in pre-medical sciences. And so that required me to work for a few years before I could go to graduate school. And My father was a telephone lineman, and their charity was Special Olympics, and that is where folks obviously with developmental disabilities compete in sports, and it's a great organization. So he got my brothers and I into Special Olympics, and so we were around folks with developmental disabilities a lot as young guys, and that led to my older brother working in group homes and giving me jobs during college and after college to do direct care with folks with mental health and mental retardation. And I then eventually started managing group homes for folks on the spectrum and with severe behavior disorders. And I was still trying to go to medical school, but I was digging my way out of those grades. And so it was taking me some time. And during that time, I was just getting different jobs. I got to work at some hospitals, and it really taught me over time that that behavior analysis was something I wanted to do. So when I was in Baltimore, I had a chance to take a class with Charlie Catania, and he's done a lot of great things for our field, obviously, and textbooks and amazing research. And so his class really got me jazzed about something that I hadn't really thought about getting into. I was still planning to go to medical school, but learning about some of the basic work with animals, and especially his choice research and research on self-control, I just had a clarity of thought on why people behave the way they do that I never had before. So that was kind of my first, the big idea that behavior can be explained by environmental contingencies came out of, working with folks with intellectual disabilities and then getting the depth of the behavior conceptual system from Dr. Catania's class. And so that's really how I accidentally fell into it. I think part of that journey was also, I was an avid reader. I studied English in college once I got kicked out of my science classes. But I was reading a lot, and one of the books I was reading at the time I was working with folks with intellectual disabilities was the Chomsky Reader. And so Noam Chomsky had a selected reading series, and I was attracted to Noam Chomsky's writing. He's a linguistic professor from MIT, and many people know him for writing a fairly angry, diatribe against Skinner's verbal behavior analysis and other ways of knowing that was Skinnerian. But at the time, I was using Skinnerian principles in my work, but really appreciating Chomsky's message about, the not being a tool for the man, basically. So as a young guy, I really liked his message, his concern with corporate control. But Chomsky was concerned with corporations, controlling young people in America, but he was also really concerned with that scientific control that he associated with Skinner. And so it was through Chomsky that I learned about Skinner, and he was so angry in the chapters about Skinner, and it was different writing than his other writing, it made me want to read Skinner. So I started looking into it a little bit more, and that was about the time I was taking a course with Charlie Catania, and that's when it all came together. Reading some Skinner via Chomsky, which is always interesting, and then getting some depth in the conceptual system while I was applying it in a place that was amazingly scientific at the time. That all came together and made it very obvious this is what I was going to do.
I've never had anyone explain a pivot. I call them pivotal moments. I don't know where that came from, but we've been using it. But I've never had anyone explain like a pivotal moment as clarity of thought. And it made me think of moments in my learning history when I was studying biology at school, and I had a clarity, I'm going to call it a clarity of thought moment. Was this clarity of thought like world changing for you? Did it kind of shift your perception on how you saw the world? Can you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Sure. I mean, I think obviously I fell into the field in a progressive manner. These things take time, but there were clearly pivotal moments where when I was reading basically science and human behavior, that things were making sense to me because I was working at the time with folks with extraordinary severe forms of problem behavior. It was on a multidisciplinary team. I was as attracted to the genetics of behavioral disorders as I was to the environmental control of those things. And it was really that reading Skinner, it was pivotal to take me over to a practical understanding of the behavior. And so as a young person, I was just trying to understand, but because I had the opportunity to make a difference with people, I needed something practical. And so there really was reading Skinner's work, Science and Human Behavior, while trying to help families with severe behavior problems with great supervision by people at the hospital. It was a critical moment for me. It made it very clear to me I was not interested in studying genetics at that point. Too late. I wanted to study something that I could do something with now. I wanted a malleable set of variables, and so I would say there was a few month period where it became painfully obvious that studying for the medical exams was not on my list of things to do anymore, and instead I needed to go deep on behavior analysis.
And obviously, studying for behavior analysis was reinforcing more so than partying and having a good time.
Oh, sure. I was still having fun, but I was much more of a mature person at that point.
And so what happened next? So you're in the class, you started to learn about behavior analysis. Where did your career take you after that?
Well, after that, I went down to the University of Florida and studied behavior analysis with Brian Awada. And what was really great about that program was I got to study with Brian, who was at the time a leader in many things ABA, but he's known best nowadays for his work on functional analysis and function-based treatments for severe behavior. So that was wonderful. But it was also an experimental analysis of behavior program. And it did a really great job blurring the distinction between experimental analysis of behavior and applied behavior analysis. They did a very good job just making it clear it's all behavior analysis. And so again, I got a really wonderful experience there, learning a lot about basic studies and work with non-human animals and etc. And then from there, my wife and I went to the University of Kansas, and we worked in the Human Development Family Life Department that then transitioned to a new name, the Applied Behavioral Science Department, which was a better fit. And that was an amazing experience because I had worked for 8 or so years before going to grad school. So I was already old for a graduate student in some ways, and not a spring chicken going into an academic role. But going to University of Kansas was like going to graduate school all over again. Don Bear was a few doors down from me. Mont Wolf was still teaching there, and James Sherman and Joe Spradlin and Don Bushell. And if you don't know these folks, please know that these are the founding fathers of ABA, arguably Beer, Wolf, and Risley of that grouping. And so it was amazing to visit everyone's lab and have some of the folks visit my research group and give us feedback. And so that was just fundamental to be at the University of Kansas for about 6 years. And we worked with preschoolers there. My wife and I ran a child development center on the campus. And then we came home back to New England, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts area. And we began a program at Western New England University, a doctoral program in behavior analysis, and then a master's program. And that has been going on about 13 years. And that, again, wonderful opportunity and a great faculty colleagues. There's a lot of super behavior analysts in Massachusetts. So I've been very lucky from the get-go to always be in a community where there were people that knew more than me. And I always tell my students that the best job is one where you don't know the most. If you think you're going to be the big boss and the one teaching everybody, then don't take that job. Get yourself in a community where you keep learning. And so that's always been the case. And right now, I officially left the university in a formal sense. I don't have any teaching or administrative responsibilities. I simply advise doctoral students on research And I have a company now called FTF Behavioral, and we're a group of doctoral level behavior analysts that just go wherever people want us to help them learn how to safely assess and treat severe behavior, sleep problems, eating issues, and we have an international focus. Our goal is to have half of our clients be outside the U.S., and we're just under that right now, maybe a third. And it's really great. We've been doing research for a lot of years, and I'll keep doing research because I learn a lot through research. However, we get to support so many different children and young adults with severe behavior, sleep problems, and eating issues by consulting with other companies that our ability to revise our practical processes, just because the number of experiences is so much greater than it was when I was spending more time, teaching and administering and all that. And so the last year and a half has been incredible for learning how to do things better, just because the sample of experience is so much bigger with this FTF group where I'm a part of right now.
Well, firstly, congratulations on the success of your company and approximating yourself towards that goal of 50% of your clients outside of the US. It's pretty cool. So how did you decide what you wanted to do? You mentioned before that you just wanted to help families. Is that what drives you?
I don't know. It's just happened. It seems kind of by accident. Behavior goes where reinforcement flows, as people say, and I think that's primarily it. I found myself being effective once I found behavior analysis. I was effective with the timing of consequences. I found myself effective interacting with people. I learned that I could figure out reinforcers pretty quick, and given the tools that people taught me, and I just found it reinforcing. I think that's it. And then it just went from there. I always wanted to write. I think that's why I studied English. I wasn't terribly good at it, but I liked the thought of writing. I liked reading a lot. But I wasn't much of a writer until I started writing about things from behavior analysis. So again, it's these general preferences shaped somehow from my youth, and then they just got picked up by these professional reinforcers. But I do find that I like to solve problems, whether it's a mechanical, getting a bike to pedal properly, a motorcycle to be properly carbureted and all that. I like solving little problems, and problems of behavior are challenging. There's noise in the system, and there's always a lot of factors. And so I think that's probably why I gravitate to it. But I'm also a social person. I like people. And so I like, being able to help people in particular with those kind of problems. And then there's the science part. I've always been, again, I didn't study it terribly well, but I studied science, and I like that worldview. I like the scientific assumptions. And so behavior analysis is amazing to me for that. It involves problem solving, and you have the science part, but there's a human element as well. Whether you're working with animals or non-human animals or human animals, there's a connection in the work, and so I think that's a big part of it for me.
So I'm curious, what is, thinking back in my career and talking to other people on this podcast show, there's always kind of like one problem that you solved that, and I am reinforced by the process of solving problems as well. My wife doesn't get it. I love brainstorming. When there's a problem, she's like, Ryan, you get to brainstorm now, yay. And I can remember the brainstorms and the problems that I've solved in the past that were, for me, pivotal moments. Is there any kind of problem that you've solved in your career that kind of sticks out to you and gave you the warm and fuzzies?
Sure. Perhaps the thing is, it's like off air, we were talking a little bit about street art and how it's all derivative, and that's kind of what makes it fun to see the history of each piece. But I think the problems I've solved, it's the same way. I've seen other people solve the problem before me. They teach me how to solve that problem. And then in my own team's solving of the problem, we develop the technology through experience. And I guess that's what's given me the warm and fuzzy. So I worked with Kathleen Piazza at a time. She's a wonderful behavior analyst. Most people know her for assessment and treatment of feeding disorders. But nevertheless, she taught me a lot about how to assess and treat sleep problems. And I remember finding that pretty amazing, that sleep that seems so biologically complex is incredibly sensitive to environmental contingencies and environmental factors that can be manipulated to improve sleep and outcomes associated with sleep. And so I spent a lot of pro bono work helping people with sleep problems once I went to grad school and at University of Kansas, because I loved helping a family either have an infant sleep better or a young child sleep better or an adult sleep better. They travel too much and their sleep clock gets off. And I found that incredibly reinforcing to take something that it was such a struggle for the person. And a lot of people had so many myths about their own sleep problem. Well, this is just who I am. No one in my family sleeps well, so I just have to accept it. And I loved that within 3 to 4 nights, we could make a difference that would last sometimes a lifetime. And so that problem in particular is highly reinforcing to solve. And then the other one is severe behavior. Still to this day, it's still a challenge. But this is when a child's engaging in severe self-injury and aggression, and it's just sapping the joy out of a family. It's very rewarding to first bust through the myths, to teach people that is not autism, and that is not intellectual disability. It's an accident of learning, and you can do something about it, and that no family should live with severe behavior. There is no excuse, and we can teach some skills and get that down to 0. It's not an 80% reduction, not good enough. And that's very reinforcing when a family is just feeling better about life and living a better life because there's no threat of severe behavior. So I don't think there'll ever be a time where I get bored with that outcome. It's always exciting when that problem is solved, and it's even more reinforcing when it's solved by the parents. In other words, it's not a clinic model. It's not experts doing all the heavy lifting and then doing some fancy generality tactics. It's the family or the teacher or the aide implementing the process and creating the change that will last for a long time. That's where my reinforcers are now.
Well, I think the listeners of the show or there's probably people going, talk more on sleep because I'd sleep terribly.
yeah, no doubt. Well, it would be great. I'll come back. We'll do a little webinar. But there is I will give this shout out. We have a website, and for $100 a month, I'm just kidding. I can't even carry the joke going. It's a free website. The free website is practicalfunctionalassessment.com. Again, one more time, the website's practicalfunctionalassessment.com, and it's not terribly well designed because I designed it from my basement a handful of years ago. But nevertheless, if you go to implementation support and you scroll down, there's a bunch of materials on sleep, one of which is a handout. And I've never had better feedback in my career than on this handout. People write to me and say, I downloaded your handout and my kid's sleeping great. Or I flipped it over and saw the section on for the adult and I applied it and I'm doing pretty good. So I would recommend, if any listener really is struggling with sleep problems or their child is, that they go to this website and download the document, the sleep document. And I think they might even get some traction. It's rare in my world for bibliotherapy to be an active independent variable. Bibliotherapy means reading something and allowing that to leading to meaningful behavior change. But when it comes to sleep, bibliotherapy, just reading about how to engineer your world to get your biology and your environmental factors aligned can lead to a meaningful outcome. So I recommend that site.
I feel like I'm going to be doing that and sharing with my wife later today.
Good luck.
Sapping the joy out of the family. There's people that work with dog clients who are resonating with that. I feel they go into the house and the dog's barking nonstop, or they can't have visitors over, or they can't go on a walk when there's other dogs around. So definitely hear on a weekly basis about joy being sucked out of families with dogs as well. And I'm curious, when you are working with human clients, do the human clients know? Do they have an understanding of behavior analysis and that's the kind of help that they're getting, or do you have to jump in there and kind of teach them from scratch about reinforcement and environmental setup? What kind of clients are you working with?
It's a good question. I mean, we don't do as much direct because our company FTF is a capacity building organization. And because of licensing rules in the states, at least, we can't just practice in every state. So what we usually do is link up with a hospital or a school or a company, and we train their professionals, and then we implement assessment treatment with them. So it's a coaching model, basically. We do some face-to-face and some at a distance. And we work with all sorts of families, many families who have children or adults on the spectrum, autism spectrum, but we've refined our process now to expand our scope of competence. So we work with folks that have high IQs, children, gifted children, or folks with psychiatric conditions and generalized anxiety and oppositional defiant disorder, usually the main ones, if they are not on the spectrum. But as back to the early part of your question, Ryan, if you could remind me, so the second part of the question was, what are the kind of families? But you started the question out with something about joy. I remember.
I was drawing a link between what my mind is saying is the similarities between your work and ours, and we're going into families that are also struggling when we're working with behavior problems with domestic animals in the house. And I know, so maybe our clients are a little bit different in so much as we're kind of working with clients that don't necessarily understand that they've hired someone that is kind of coming in with a behavioral analytical framework, and they don't even know what that is. Yes. They just want their dog to stop doing things.
No, that's exactly. Thank you. That's the cue I needed. We're the same. Parents often don't know what our worldview is, or that we're behavior analysts. We're supporting sometimes psychologists, sometimes special educators, sometimes speech language pathologists. And so our orientation is apparent to anyone who asks. Our orientation is apparent to anyone who reads any of our research or goes to a website, but we don't put it out front. And I'll tell you, I used to do a lot of parent training where I taught parents the principles of behavior. And it was basically behavior analysis 101. And then from there, we would move to problems. And I don't do that anymore. I try to just be problem centric, to be honest. What's the big problem? Is it self-injury? Is it aggression? Is it sleep? Is it food selectivity? And then we do open-ended interviews to have them teach us about the problem. So we try to build relationships from the get-go, not by observing, not by expounding on our behavioral science, not by putting them into a mini university course, but by simply saying, tell us what the problem is, and I'll ask you some questions and what I'm trying to get out of the controlling variables. But they're teaching me. I'm doing less talking. They're doing most of the talking. And then from that, I try to educate on the process that could lead us towards a solution. I ask them what their fears are. And then we get to work. We collaborate and we shape behavior together. And there's different models of doing that, obviously. But it's basically just shaping. That's the shaping's informed by the conversation, what the target behaviors are going to be and what reinforcers we're going to use. And then we move forward. So to answer your question briefly, parents do not know they're getting ABA or behavior analysis unless they ask or happen to be in the know. And we just try to help people solve problems, and we try to emphasize certain things like safety, dignity, and relationships. Even though behavior analysts, it's hard to talk about those things sometimes. Those are our priorities: is safety first, and second, we actually have a made-up term called televisibility, which just means that everything we do in the assessment treatment process should be capable of being put on the evening news, and you'd be proud to have that aired, and that people would see that assessment treatment for that problem and say, I want that for my child. And so for us, if it's not televisable, we don't do it. And I couldn't have said that 10 years ago, and I wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years ago. But our field has progressed significantly, and we can make meaningful change while being televisable, if you will. And then the third part is the rapport or relationship building. So in the past, most applied behavior analysts, successfully changed someone's behavior, sometimes at the expense of the relationship with that person. And I know animal trainers are in that same position. And there's an obvious shift in the animal training world, at least with, I don't know what proportion of animal trainers have bought into positive reinforcement as the way, but nevertheless, I know it's larger and larger each year. And same thing in our area. I'm not against the concept of punishment. It's ubiquitous. In fact, I've studied it as a researcher. Nevertheless, as a practitioner and someone teaching practitioners, I try to rely on shaping with positive reinforcement and particular schedules. And I try to make sure everything is preferred by the learner, by the client. And when we do that, we have a good relationship with the client. We start with a good relationship. We teach from a good relationship. But again, in the past, it wasn't the case. I have to tell you that there were kids in our preschool that we would do early intervention with them, and we taught them concepts. And they, despite their diagnosis of being on the spectrum, they were able to integrate into public school classrooms. I am fairly certain that if I were to walk into that classroom, that child would not run over to me and give me a hug, because I changed behavior at the expense of the relationship. And but our field has matured a lot, and we don't need to do that, nor do we do that anymore. And it just requires a little more patience, a little more appreciation for reinforcers that have some ecological relevance, and some expertise in shaping, which doesn't come easy. It takes time to figure out how to do those things.
I love all the similarities between what you're doing with human learners and what we're doing with non-human learners. And I like that televisable. I don't know if I said that correctly, but we have a word sandwich. I don't know if that's the right word either, but we say most positive, least intrusive. So is that your way of making least intrusive make sense to a non-behavior analytical person?
Yes, sure. The reason why we have the word televisable, I'll just give you a quick history on it. Being positive and least intrusive has a long history in the field of developmental disabilities, and it's been co-opted over time. And there have been a number of values-first approaches in that area that the values were pretty spot on. However, they threw some behavior analytic technology out with those values. And I'm afraid some of those commitments left people less effective than they could have been. And that's where a lot of behavior analysts kind of got off the values first bus, whether it was person-centered planning or anti-aversives movement or positive behavioral support. But nowadays, we can have values first, and we can be wildly effective. And that's what I mean by our field's matured a lot. But I don't use those terms because of the history with the less intrusive and whatnot, at least in my world. Televisability is probably most related to the construct of social validity, written about by Montrose Wolfe and the clinical psychologist Alan Kasdan. And it's about the outcomes being meaningful, the procedures being acceptable, and the goals being acceptable as well. But televisability takes it up a notch. It turns up the expectation a little bit. I think it gives people the right perspective. Your husband will watch you do this. Your son and daughter will see you do your craft. Your mother will see you do it. Your neighbor. Policyholders, decision makers are going to watch your process. That's about televisability. Everyone that's important to you is going to watch you do your craft. Are you going to be proud of what they see? It gives it a depth that social validity and less intrusive doesn't really give. And so that's why I like this term televisability. I think it personalizes it, and it makes us work harder to get rid of the garbage from behavior change procedures.
So it's about whether you would be proud to share it, not whether you think the viewers would accept what they're saying. And just bear with me for a minute. I'm thinking of one of the most televised animal, air quotes, trainers in the world, being on National Geographic and using a lot of aversives and you said values first and widely effective. I don't say that we would necessarily label that person under that umbrella.
Yeah. Sure.
So it's more about what would make you proud to have it on television.
I think that's a great point, Ryan. It's about you. It's about you and constituents. It's really both. But you're right to emphasize that you should be proud of it. That's partly what I do when I do lecturing on these assessment treatment processes. Some of it is a little, for whatever reason, sometimes it's a little controversial, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. But what I generally tell people is you just have to defend your practice first to yourself. If you don't feel good about what you're doing with your clientele, that's a problem. Change your practice. So you're totally right that the first bit of televisability is, can you defend what you're doing to yourself? And then it is about defending it to a wider and wider array of constituents. And it should jump off the screen as being likable. That's what I'm trying to get at. Behavior analysts, we've been chirping about wanting to save the world, with behavior analysis for many, many years. One of the most wonderful articles that was inspiring I read a long time ago was actually from Psychology Today. And I think it's called Shapers at Work. And it was written in the 70s. And it's a cool article. It's in Psychology Today, an American magazine, and it's from the 70s, but it has little pictures of all the applied behavior analysts that were doing their craft. And there's about 50 of them. And it gave little bios for each one. And the article was dripping with hope. I mean, it was so positive. It was so inspiring how these 50 people were just going to change the world in every domain. And that was it was published in the 70s. We just haven't come close to that kind of change. And so you can read it and be inspired by it, or you can read it and be depressed by it. And I read it both ways. I can carry both emotions at the same time. And I think one of the reasons we haven't realized that dream is the lack of televisability of our procedures, at least in our world. A lot of parents don't like ABA. It's too drill and kill. It doesn't look right. The kid's crying. We're doing a lot of working kids through things, officially known as escape extinction. And there's just other professionals that don't care for the assertiveness of procedures that come out of our behavioral science. And I think it's partly because I'm getting a little older that I just can't sell things that have any ugliness to them. We'll always be in the margins of helping professionals if you have to go to a strange clinic where a handful of people understand what to do. No one else really understands it, but it gets the job done. That will always be in the margins that way. So again, I just emphasize to my team that we have to keep refining our procedures to make them defensible to a wide array of people, and not just defensible, but great to look at, that when kids are learning, there's joy involved. It's not just strain and stress and working through it. And just because a kid has severe problem behavior doesn't mean they can't smile and enjoy the process. I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I will ramble into one more little area. When I took a class with Charlie Catania, he introduced me to all these schedules of reinforcement. I was fascinated with the schedules, and one of which was called the concurrent chains arrangement. And that's where an animal would have an initial link where there'd be three different cues, and they could respond in these initial links to then go into what's called terminal links, where they would experience something different, in this case, different schedules, perhaps of reinforcement. And basic researchers use them at the time to determine animals' preferences for different schedules of reinforcement. Do you prefer variable versus fixed, interval versus ratio, and more complex things? And so these concurrent chains arrangements were cool because they allowed for an indicator of preference and it was separate from the performance engendered by the schedule, and they're called concurrent change arrangements. And I was fascinated by them. And so one of the first studies I ever did was using a concurrent change arrangement to evaluate whether our clients preferred contingent reinforcement or non-contingent reinforcement. And it was just the jump off of what was known earlier as the contra-freeloading effect, where non-human animals preferred to work for food than get it for free, which was kind of a counterintuitive notion. And when proper controls were put in place, it generally stood up. But we were seeing the same thing with people, that our clients preferred to yearn and earn their reinforcers rather than get them for free. And the reason why I'm bringing this up now is my research and practice has kind of come full circle, where all of our therapy now is put within a choice model where kids choose to participate in the therapeutic process, whether it's addressing food selectivity or severe behavior. If we have language-able clients, they can elect at any time to leave the room and go to another area where they have all their reinforcers for free, the same quality, the same amount. The difference is they can get them for free in one context, or they can earn them through skill development, communication, toleration, etc. It's amazing how televisable our processes are now, that we stopped mandating therapy, that we open the door, that we give these choices. And this is basically the same fundamental procedure as a concurrent change arrangement that was used, in the 50s and 60s. And it's remarkable to me how we are treating children better now than I ever used to, using the same procedures basic researchers were using with rats and pigeons 50 years ago. The same procedures people at the DC Zoo were using with chimpanzees, where they always had they could choose to go to work or they could stay in their home cages. And so I guess to wrap up the point, it's not enough to change behavior in our world. It's important that the process of behavior change is agreeable to the person whose behavior is being changed and the people that care for that person. And it's taken me a long time to arrive at that, despite the fact that it was right under my nose, and it's been available to our field of applied behavior analysis for decades.
In the words of Greg Hanley, this episode is dripping with hope, as is the podcast show. And I was privy to you talking about this in 2016 at ABA Week at Auckland University. You won't remember, but I was hunkered down in the crowd going, I won't put my hand up because these people are all behavior analysts and I'm just a little animal trainer. But you talked about choice then and giving the autistic kids that you're working with when you presented on them at the ABA Week, and I left inspired. And I've wanted, and that was in 2016, and I've wanted to get you on the ATA podcast show ever since then. So when that other Ryan O'Donnell, big shout out to him, saving the world, as you said, with behavior analysis. So consequently, I'm super excited about doing this episode today and to share these ideas with the ATA podcast show's audience. And when we caught up last week, you talked about that you have, let me just check my notes to make sure I get this right. Your passion is getting ideas out to people. And you had 5 big ideas that you wanted to share with animal trainers in 2020. Can you run through these with us?
Yeah, certainly. I kind of foreshadowed a few, but I guess this kind of redundancy is good. The first one is that all our procedures are derived from our priorities. So that's an idea that I try to make sure that everyone we consult with embraces, because changing complex behavior and developing skill-based repertoires takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of decisions and moment-to-moment decisions. Well, if the child does this, what do I do? If the child does that, what do I do? And we could write it all down, and we'll eventually manualize it. But even written all down, you'll never be able to have that manual and flip hundreds of pages to figure out what to do in a moment. And we all know that timing and the precision with which we prompt and reinforce and weight, etc., is critical. And so this notion of procedures come from priorities has been really helpful at conveying good procedures to people, in the sense that we try to work with people what their priorities are. Our priorities, again, are safety, televisability, and rapport. And so let's say, for instance, a very simple example is a child is engaging in problem behavior, and we're going to change the contingency. And now all they have to do is hand a card or put their thumb to their chest or say the words "my way." And when they do that, we're going to deliver their reinforcers. And so instead of problem behavior yielding the reinforcer, some adaptive behavior, communication behavior, well, simple differential reinforcement. Now, people do that. The child's handing the card like a champ, but on this particular moment, he regresses. All behavior vacillates a bit. There's always a range in the operant class. And so there's a little regression, and instead of handing the card, he slaps the teacher. What does he do right then and there? Now, we can manualize all these things, but instead we say, remember your priorities. What would be the safest thing to do right then? What would be the most televisable thing to do right then, etc.? And so in the past, we would recommend people do extinction, have a very strong differential reinforcement contingency. Now that we have priorities, an appropriate thing to do would be to prompt the expected behavior, or even reinforce problem behavior. Reinforcing problem behavior actually stops the ongoing behavior and allows you to teach another trial. Any extinction-based phenomena usually results in escalation, inducement of worse forms of behavior, and the child crosses into what we call, for lack of a better term, the emotional borderlands, and they're crying and upset, and now it's going to take a long period of time to get another learning trial done. None of those procedures are in our process anymore because they don't dovetail with our priorities. So instead, we will let those procedures be developed from our priorities of safety and televisability. So that's a big idea. That helps people do our process in our absence, because they can solve problems about what to do in the moment because they can filter those problems through their priorities. And it's funny that for me to even hear myself say these things, because I was so against, as a younger dude in this field, I was so against values first approaches. I'm like, it's all about the outcome. If I can get there, we're getting there with these procedures. These values first people don't seem to be getting there with their procedures. I clearly am not a values first person, but I've realized over time that you can have both. And in fact, putting the priorities or values first makes you better at this craft of assessing and treating problem behavior. So I guess that's the first big idea. And it's been a long time in the making for me. For some people, it's easy. They adopt it. Of course. By contrast, other people like me take some time because they're so committed to procedures because they have the history of reinforcement for those procedures, especially in contexts where they're protected, like hospitals and whatnot. But when practitioners tend to go out on their own and work in homes and work in public schools, those priorities become ever more important as they apply their craft. I guess my second idea, Ryan, is that what people's priorities might be. And I don't ask people to necessarily have my priorities. I just share what mine are. And again, they're safety, televisability, and rapport. Safety seems fairly obvious, but it is not obvious. When you're assessing and treating severe behavior, it seems inevitable that it's going to be unsafe at times. Well, the child they hit themselves. So at some times they're going to hit themselves. They have a history of aggression. So at some times they're going to lash out at the behavior analyst. It seems to be assumed. And I fell into that trap. But it's a dangerous one. We have enough technology nowadays to know that you can assess and treat severe behavior having never seen the severe behavior. When we did functional analyses in the past, it seemed if we wanted to understand SIB, we had to turn on SIB and turn it off and turn it on in a scientific way in a functional analysis. And I don't believe that's the case anymore. And in fact, I think it's downright harmful to put a child in a room who slaps themselves or bangs their head against the floor and allow any programming for that to be occasioned and occurring just to understand it. And I'm not saying not to do functional analysis. We do functional analysis. It's almost an obligation when we help people. However, there's ways to engineer it so it can be safe. There's several examples. One very simple example is many children who engage in self-injury engage in some response before they bang their head. They may stand up in body tense. They may groan, moan, push something away. Those behaviors, research is very clear on this, are in the same operant class as a self-injury. If they co-occur in the same circumstance, if they terminate when reinforcement is provided, just like SIB does, they are members of the same response class. And there's some great studies out there. One recently, one of my students published by Christy Warner. It's in JABA, Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. And it was 9 consecutive children. We found that their precursor behavior was functionally in the same response class as their severe behavior. And so it's a very safe assumption that if you can turn on and off foot stomping, and foot stomping precedes self-injury, then you understand why the child's engaging in self-injury, having only seen foot stomping. So it's this notion of response class. So you can still be scientific and direct measurement and turning on and off behavior, but you don't need to put anybody in an unsafe situation. And so that's just an example of if you have a priority of safety, it's going to commit you to particular ways to do a functional analysis. It's going to commit you to particular behavior change procedures that steer clear of inducement of escalated behavior. And so again, the big idea is have priorities, filter your procedures through them, and consider the priorities of safety, televisability, and rapport. And the third one for me is holism. Holism's in America. I don't know what it's like in different parts of the world, but when people in America hear holism, they think of alternative therapies and they think of scented candles and massage oils, holistic sorts of therapies. But holism is at first, it always has been a scientific concept. And holism is the concept that whole things have properties that can't be found in the parts. And I was doing some reading, and this concept of holism was coming up in some scientific pieces I was reading. And I don't know when it happened, but we learned accidentally through some analyses that when reinforcers were presented simultaneously, as they often are in nature, that they had a more profound effect on the behavior than when those same reinforcing events were provided individually. So a simple example would be if you did a functional analysis and if the child had a problem behavior, they got to escape some ongoing unfortunate event like non-preferred work. But in a very different condition, if they engaged in problem behavior, they got attention and maybe access to an iPad. And that's how we used to do functional analysis. We asked the question, was the behavior functioning to produce positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? Or was it producing attention or tangible items? And when we started combining the reinforcers into a singular contingency, that in the test, in other words, the child would engage in problem behavior, that allowed them to terminate the aversive event as well as access all appetitive events, attention, material reinforcers, that we're seeing strong control over behavior. And in fact, we have a couple studies where we published where when you isolated the reinforcers, they did not influence behavior. But when you combined them, they did. And at that time, we called it a synthesized reinforcement contingency. And it really is highly consistent with that construct of holism, that whole reinforcement contingencies, as they appear in nature to be emulated in analyses, those whole contingencies have properties that you can't find in the parts. And what we also noticed is when we were using whole reinforcement contingencies, escape from to access other things, we were so much faster with our skill development because the whole reinforcement contingency was less affected by momentary fluctuations in the value of any particular reinforcer. So if escape, the value fluctuates. Attention, the value fluctuates. They may or may not be into that game at that moment in time. But when you provide all the reinforcers following a behavior, it takes care of those momentary fluctuations. You always have a motivated learner. And so this concept of holism that we accidentally stumbled upon in our practice and eventually pulled into our research allowed us to be way more effective functionally analyzing problem behavior, way more effective developing skills. But it's also cost me in a sense that it's a hard concept for some people to embrace because it seems sloppy. It's been called many negative things, the kitchen sink approach, just throwing all reinforcers at kids. It doesn't seem scientific. It doesn't even seem analytic because it doesn't seem like you're breaking down the controlling variables into the pockets that we're used to them being in. But for me, it's as analytic as anything else. It's just the level of analysis is at a different it's at a different level. It's like the microscope has been moved up a little bit. Instead of being hyper analytic and trying to break naturally occurring combined contingencies into their component parts, we simply emulate them as they appear in nature. But it's still analytic. We still have control over behavior, etc. But again, it's a little controversial, and some people are slow to warm to the idea. And then I guess the other part of holism that's been important is in at least in the world of autism, you have a lot of programs and you break up the things kids need to learn that other kids maybe learn by accident, that kids with autism need more support to learn. Everything's in a folder and there's a program and there's 10 trials for this to learn how to wash your hands and 10 trials to use your social skills and 10 trials to practice not being impulsive, etc. We really don't advocate for those sort of systems. Our teaching is basically one folder. We work on all skills kind of in the same fluid interaction, and that's been a pivotal change for our group. So kind of synthesizing programming and synthesizing reinforcement has been the game changer for me in my career as far as my effectiveness as a practitioner and coach, and for my team as well. But that's our big idea. That's our third big idea, holism. I feel like I'm talking, Brian, I want you to say something because I'm monologuing too much. I would turn off the podcast at this point unless you say something, right?
Something. I think that dog trainers and animal trainers, I'm thinking about a dog example now, would resonate with this in, for example, going into a client's house, working on barking behavior. And barking behavior for a dog would have lots of different functions depending on the context. And so I'm curious to know from the podcast audience and to explore myself and to continue the conversation after this podcast, if we can, what was the word you used? I've lost it. Synthesize reinforcers, was that it?
Yes, that's right. Synthesize reinforcement.
Synthesize reinforcers for barking behavior and include it in, how do you word it? I've made some notes here, so I'm trying to find it. Work on, use all of those reinforcers in one interaction, as well as you said, work on different behaviors. So not just working on barking, but working on different behaviors that we might want to build with this dog or this animal, and using all of those reinforcers as a consequence of a desired behavior.
You're right on. Just dogs and people, there's more similarities, as you know, than not. Unwanted behavior, if a dog has multiple topographies or forms of unwanted behavior, they're probably serving the same purpose. They're functionally related. And it's not just that the reinforcers are different depending on the context. I think that's the case too. But what we're understanding now is that in the same context, the behavior is controlled by multiple reinforcers that are delivered simultaneously, that sometimes they can't even be disentangled. And so your group is probably aware of some of these early studies by Clive Wynne and maybe some folks at Tim Bowman's group, where they did functional analysis of unfortunate dog behavior, like excessive barking, for instance. And the analysis was geared towards figuring out, well, are they doing this to get some attention from their owner? Or are they doing this to terminate some aversive event, perhaps someone coming to the door? Or are they doing this to get some tangible reward. Maybe people give them treats to get them to stop barking. And so they've learned over time, as long as they bark, intensely, there's some upgrade, with some treats or something. So the functional analysis has been to ask the question, is it attention? Is it to get some social upgrade? Is it tangible or snack-based, a treat? Or is it to terminate an aversive event? And what I'm saying is that we don't need to ask that question. That if in the environment people report that, sometimes people walk away from him when he's barking voraciously. And yes, sometimes I try to calm him down by going over and petting him and talking to him. And sometimes I give him treats just to shut him the hell up. If they say those things, then I'm going to evaluate those things together because they have more power together. It's an interaction. So those animal trainers out there that like to think scientifically, it's a difference between a main effect and an interaction. A main effect is the effect of that one reinforcer. An interaction means one of those reinforcers, the power depends on the presence of the other reinforcer. And synthesized contingencies have power not in just an additive manner. We think they have power because they interact. That if you escape to something, that escape is more valuable. That treat is more valuable if the postman left the door. Do you see what I'm saying? These things add power to each other. And when we break them up, we sometimes render them inert, and they're not as powerful in our training when they're separated. And so that's really the point, I think, with dog training. Dog trainers may have seen this new research where they're doing functional analysis of these aberrant dog behaviors. And I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful that functional analysis is moving towards that. However, it's following a trajectory that hope isn't as long as it was with children with disabilities. I hope it doesn't take 30 years before someone combines the reinforcers and understands that it has great power, and that they'll be able to change dog behavior probably more quickly if they don't parcel out their reinforcers into their little categories and be stingy with the reinforcer and only give a social reinforcer or terminate an aversive event or give a treat. That they work well together, and there's no reason to parcel them out that I can come up with.
Well, you've got a couple of thousand listeners of this show that are going to probably go out there and try that now. Number 4 is...
Okay, number four. Number 4 is going to resonate with your audience because they're already doing it, and it's just about the big idea for us is shaping from joy and shaping with freedom. And I know those are fuzzy terms, and as behavior analysts, some people can have a little struggle with them. When I mean freedom, I obviously mean the illusion of freedom. And joy, well, you know it when you see it. I've had dogs my whole life. I know joy in my dog, and I know when it's not joy. It doesn't take an advanced degree to figure that one out. So my point with this big idea number 4 is there's a lot of ways to change behavior, but it doesn't mean we should be using all of them. And the other point is the starting point. So much applied behavior analysis when it comes to severe behavior and teaching kids with autism that are struggling to learn is there's a lot of crying historically. There's crying, there's stress, there's struggle. And I don't mean to reveal the underbelly of ABA, but understand folks that work routinely with folks with severe behavior, they're known as the people who restrain, who time out, who have to use seclusion, who have to carry kids, two people carrying down the hallway, and forced compliance and all that stuff. And we're known for that. Understand, it's not the most televisable, and it may be necessary in a particular moment for a particular learner, but our goal should be every day figuring out a technology where we don't have to do those things, because I don't want to be known as the restrainer or the timeout guy or the guy you call when Johnny's melting down to then apply my craft. And so we flip that. We want to teach from joy. I want that kid smiling. I want him as happy as he can be. And then from there, we will teach. We don't work kids through it. We work kids to joy. And then from there, we shape. And so we have all sorts of goofy acronyms, one of which is HRE. And there's people that make T-shirts about it. It's caught on in our little subculture, but it's happy, relaxed, and engaged. And so even when we're going in and we're going into, let's say, a hospital, and we're going to do an analysis on severe aggression and self-injury, the very first step in the functional analysis is to get happy, relaxed, and engaged. That's the first step of the assessment process. And we want them to want to stay in the assessment area. In other words, there's freedom to leave. You can leave whenever you want. Our job is to inspire you to stay. If we didn't do our job, you will teach us that. You will leave. In other words, we didn't have the right set of interactions, the right materials. Sometimes when we leave, we follow the person and not follow them and creep them out, but we are basically following their lead. And some people, they'll go, some learners will go to a window. They love to look out the window. They love to watch the traffic. That's their thing. Well, they teach us that now we're going to have to do the analysis there, because the only way they're going to be happy, relaxed, and engaged is when they're looking out the window. So we don't go in with a bunch of a priori assumptions about where we're going to do an analysis, how we're going to do the analysis. We learn from an interview, and then we let the child's performance dictate the speed of the process. And the first step in that process is making sure they want to be where they are, that there's no better place for them to be, and that they are happy, relaxed, and engaged. And once they're that, then we start the analysis. In other words, we put in challenging events. We see how they respond to them. We quickly provide reinforcement for any problem behavior to turn it off as soon as it's turned on. We replace the problem behavior with communication. We introduce intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement, and we start shaping repertoires of behavior. It's all shaping, but the emphasis I want to make with this big idea number 4, it's not shaping through duress. It's not mandating a participation in the shaping process. It's allowing our clients freedom to choose, to elect to participate in the therapeutic process. And it's about teaching from happy, relaxed, and engaged, because the reinforcement is basically a return to that context in which they have all their reinforcers and there are no threats. And it may not sound different than how a lot of animal trainers do their work. I mean, I fully recognize by going to zoos and talking to some animal behaviorists about how, especially dangerous animals, they get the choice to participate in behavior change. And I guess, if anything, I'm embarrassed that it's taken me so long to bring it to clinical populations that we work with. But at the same time, I think bringing it back to animal trainers, I think the big idea here could be pretending that all creatures that people work with are as big and dangerous as the most dangerous they can think of. I don't know what the most dangerous animals to work with, but horses, I understand, can be tough to work with, and rhinos and tigers and etc. I'd want you to imagine that the smallest marsupial had the same danger capability as any of those larger beasts, and to make sure your process, your training process, respects that. And I think if we're starting to do that now. We could do things a little more draconian with a 3-year-old on the spectrum. We can get away with a little faster pace to our therapy, but we treat that 3-year-old child on the spectrum as though they were 25 years old and were extremely savvy in their ability to counter control and perhaps even hurt themselves or hurt others. And we provide that respect and make sure that our process, again, is filled with a lot of joy, and so we can stay away from those dangerous areas. I guess the other part of our assumptions is, at least with humans, is we just assume that all our kids have a trauma history. We assume that they've all been abused or neglected, whether we have information that they have or not. I mean, it's very hard going through life not being able to talk and having a cognitive impairment. And so the abuse and neglect with that population is quite real. But we simply assume that all clients have been abused and neglected. Again, it's kind of like imagining that all the animals you work with are dangerous. I'd want people to consider the fact that maybe all the animals you work with, just pretend that they've all been abused and neglected and treat them as you would an abused and neglected animal. If we did that generally, we'd have quite the televisable process. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's really the big idea here. It's these fundamental assumptions that they're just assumptions, that they don't have to be right. It's better to assume that the person can really hurt themselves or hurt you. It's better to assume that they've been abused or neglected, in the sense that it'll help guide you towards a process that champions those priorities of safety, televisability, and relationship building. And so, again, the other thing I want to emphasize here is there's a lot of ways to change behavior, but we shape. And doesn't mean we don't throw some prompts in there. You got to throw some prompts in there. They facilitate behavior change. Shaping would be awfully slow, painfully slow, if we only waited for the next iteration of the behavior that was a little better than before. So we put prompting in play, but we try to use it minimally so we don't overly control the situation. And we think learning via experience lives on well. And that probably resonates with your folks. But understand that shaping is a little bit lost in behavior analysis, because we've become so professional and we've codified things and written them down. And so it leads to somewhat of an inflexible technology, and shaping requires flexibility. And so I do want to make it clear that our big idea is shaping, although it's going to seem so painfully obvious to most of your listeners. And I guess number 5, I'll just be quick with wrapping up these ideas, is number 5 is the schedule we use. And it's not a schedule you'll even read in Catania's textbook, one of the best textbooks of behavior analysis, because it's a schedule that doesn't come from the operant laboratory. It's more of a schedule of life. And it's simply put, intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement. And it's a schedule for to maintain multiple responses. And so that's why it doesn't come from an operant lab that usually has 1 or 2 manipulanda. It's a schedule that maintains repertoires of problem behavior, and we leverage it to maintain repertoires of social and contextually appropriate behaviors. And so intermittent unpredictable reinforcement basically simply means that we do not foreshadow which behavior is going to be reinforced. And with animal trainers, they may say, well, that's obvious, but please know with humans, it's not obvious. People love to give if-then statements and tell people what they're working for, and putting text schedules and picture schedules up, making it very clear, if you do X, Y, and Z, then this particular thing will happen. We don't generally champion any of that. We simply use intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement to maintain different chains of lengths of behavior. So, for instance, child may communicate. We may disappoint the child, say, put that iPad down, my friend, and let's go over here and do some work. And they say, well, could I have a little bit more time on the iPad? Intermittently and unpredictably, we're going to say yes, of course. We're not going to foreshadow that. We're simply going to do it every now and then, and we're not going to tell them. And that's going to keep that communication alive for the 4 out of 5 or 9 out of 10 times where they say, can I have a little more time? And we say, no, I'm sorry, you can't. We need to transition, do some work. Now, we're going to teach them an explicit, what we call tolerance response. The child's going to say, okay, I understand. We're going to shape that. Now, we're going to have to reinforce that some of the time. So, again, going back to the very beginning, we disappoint the child. Sorry, buddy, you got to turn off the game and go do some work. They say, excuse me, could I have a little more time? Sometimes we're going to say yes. Most of the time, we're going to say no. We say no, they're going to handle it. They're going to say, okay, no problem, I understand. Sometimes we're going to say, you're so great, you can just go play a video game. We'll work later. Intermittently, unpredictably reinforcing that. Then sometimes they're going to transition to the table. They're going to have a worksheet with 50 math problems on it, 50. Sometimes they're going to do 1 math problem, and we're going to say, that is great work. Get out of here. Go back and do your game. Sometimes they're going to have to do 50. Sometimes they have to do 20. We don't tell them in advance how many they're going to have to do. It's intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement. And by doing that, speaking casually, that schedule keeps hope alive. So for the child that finds work at this point in their career to be drudgery, the hope's alive because they know at any minute some response is going to result in reinforcement. And it allows, speaking more technically, for persistence of responding. It allows for long chains of behavior to be established by making sure you reinforce always some short ones, medium ones, long, extra long. So I was trapped up early in my career with schedules of FRs and VRs and VIs, and they have utility, but they're constrained by their history in the lab. We're dealing with humans that have complex repertoires of behavior that require a different sort of schedule, and we think this intermittent unpredictable one is the one. We have some apps on that free website where teachers they shake the phone and it tells them, basically the bandwidth of where they could reinforce. We have a treatment app being developed now that has some algorithms built that keep kind of like a little shaping window going, and the child's performance helps the program prompt the teacher up to the range of responses that they should consider reinforcing at the moment. And so this notion of intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement is real powerful for us because it allows us to maintain complex and extended repertoires of behavior and allows for a lot of non-reinforcement time to be built in. And so I guess that's my other emphasis. Last thing I want to say on that schedule is, as I was listening to your podcast, I kept hearing about jackpot reinforcement, and I've seen a couple studies. Jesus Rosales-Ruiz has one, and a few others I've read. And I know jackpot reinforcement is about giving a larger magnitude reinforcer every now and then. And I assume if you're doing it well, you're giving it for a behavior that was somewhat good, better than before, and maybe hit that terminal training target. We do a thing with our intermittent unpredictable schedules called surprise shorties. Now, I know it's a stupid term. I like stupid terms before we make them technical and scientific. But a surprise shorty, being a little mentalistic, is like this. You give the signal that there's going to be a whole bunch of behavior required to earn your reinforcement. Like, okay, kids, you got to write 5 essays, and then we'll get to go outside and play basketball. And the surprise shorty is when the child simply gets up, sharpens their pencils, and gets to work. You hit them with the reinforcer. You say, you know what? You're so good at starting your work. Let's all go outside and play hoops right now. It's a surprise short requirement that was reinforced. And so a surprise shorty is similar to a jackpot, but I think quite different. And I've been talking to my students about maybe doing some comparative research on this. I can see the bang some people might get for their buck with these jackpots. But there's also, Jesus' studies show there might not be much of an effect because it's just a change in the magnitude of the reinforcer. And magnitude is arguably among the weakest of reinforcement dimensions that allow for behavior to be differentiated. This notion of providing reinforcement unexpectedly early in a chain of behavior, to me, has a great power. And we don't have strong research on it yet, but again, our group's starting to enter that area. But I was thinking about that with animal trainers. There's a lot of chaining. I see it with dogs, and especially competitions and whatnot, but they go through a series of behaviors, and those get lengthened through differential reinforcement. And it would be under those sorts of conditions where this notion of surprise shorties, of intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement, if dogs, I imagine, get a little strained as the chain gets longer. And so by providing reinforcement for various lengths of the chain of behavior, you're probably going to get a better maintenance. And I think you'll also, if you will, keep hope alive for that dog as well.
Like it, keeping hope alive. And those apps you mentioned, they're on I can just envision the podcast audience asking that question, where do I get the app? It's on the practicalfunctionalassessment.com website?
Yeah. So I want to be clear. The apps, there's some apps that they're simply randomizer apps, and they allow you to program the different responses you'd like in the response class, different chain lengths, if you will. And then you can randomize it so when you shake your phone, a different response will come up. So it allows for a less biased implementation of intermittent unpredictable reinforcement. And there's various versions of that. Yes, they're on the website practicalfunctionalassessment.com, and they're on the implementation support page. And they're not our apps. We simply link to other people's apps for those. Our apps, though, we do have an app called the ISCA app. It was made with some Italian behavior analysts, Luigi Iovino and Andrea Manito, and they made an app. We do all our analyses now off this app. It's called, these acronyms are horrible, I apologize, but it's called ISCA, IISCA, and that stands for Interview Informed Synthesized Contingency Analysis, which is just a mouthful. It's just a functional analysis done a particular way. But anyways, the ISCA app is available. You can also go to the free website for that. It's available for free right now because we're still getting feedback on it, still, I guess, in that beta version phase. But I think that's ending this month, and it'll be available on the app stores. So but it's really constrained. You use it to do an analysis. A couple groups are working on the treatment app right now, and that's not yet available, but it's pretty darn close. And that's the one where it's basically an app to do shaping. It's a shaping app, and it allows for a little bit more systematic approach to the art of shaping. And it has some performance algorithms built into it. So as you put the data in, it slides a window that kind of will keep responding going. It basically helps novice shapers from reinforcing too little and getting extinction of the participant walking away, or providing too much reinforcement and not generating enough induced novel behavior and getting to the terminal response. And those aren't yet available, Ryan, but they will be soon. And I would just encourage people to go to that free website because that's where I post anything we collaboratively develop. I post it there.
Awesome. That's exciting. So just to recap, number one, all our procedures are derived from our priorities. Number two, focusing on what your priorities actually are. Number three, wholesomeness.
Holism. That the properties of the whole reinforcement contingency can't be found in the parts. The properties of the whole program can't be found in the parts.
Holism, number three. Number four is shaping from joy and shaping from freedom.
Right on.
And number five, the schedules of life. I know that there's so much that us practitioners of the science with animals and non-human learners and the practitioners of the science with human learners have to learn from each other. And as you're talking, I just can't imagine you at one of our big animal training conferences, because I just know that the information based on the people I interact with from the podcast audience would just be setting up so many areas of curiosity and interest.
Yeah. Well, I have, to be honest, an odd fascination with the animal training world. One, I guess the negative emotion is a jealous. I love animals, and I just think it's just such a great existence to be able to work outside often and change behavior and of all different species. I think that's amazing. And so I want to throw it out there that I'd love to participate in some meaningful way in one of your conferences. I think this group has a conference in Australia. That's one of the countries we provide distance consultation to, but we've never been to. I'm working with a few behavior analysts over there to try to get there. I know they have some families interested in bringing our group out, and so we're working on that. But Ryan, you and I should just keep talking. But understand, I'd love to come to listen mainly. I know I've learned a lot in my career by listening to people who do. And in my world, I've known a lot of great practitioners, and people don't know them because they're not publishing articles. They're not known in that regard, but they've taught me as much as anybody. And animal trainers, they have that vibe to them, that they are doers, that they are out there changing behavior and not just doing behavior analysis at a laptop or from an office. And so that's my attraction. I like doing, and that's what that culture is all about. So we'll talk, and I'd love to learn from the group and maybe participate in some meaningful way to share our technologies and our values. And the overlap, I'm sure, is considerable, but I'll bet we'll each pick up a few things.
Yeah, we're doers, and then any questions we have, we just make sure that people like Jesus can answer them for us. But
yeah, he's got a great background.
Big shout out to Ryan O'Donnell, who connected us for this podcast episode and the work that he's doing with TagTeach and ChatCon and bringing together the convergence of human and animal training technology. So if you don't know about ChatCon, check it out, because that is one venue that's been created for us to get together and have conversations. Greg, I feel like you might have already answered it, but we like to end the episodes with what your vision is for the future and what you want to see happen over the next 5 to 10 years in the ABA world.
Great. What would I like to see? I guess the first thing is I'd like to see us as behavior analysts just be wildly effective with the problems people are allowing us to solve right now. And what that really is a caution against trying to expand our scope of competence and our scope of practice to all the problems of the world. We want to change the world. I get that, but we've been afforded the opportunity to address particular problems right now, the problems that are unique to autism, the problems associated with severe problem behavior, food selectivity, animal problem behavior, and issues of compliance and all that. Those are our opportunities. So my wish right now is that we are just so wildly effective that no one would question why in the world you'd have a behavior analyst helping you in that problem, because that's obviously who you need for that problem. And so that really is number one. And I think the path to get there is partly related to the conversation we had, to make sure that we're respecting relationships, we're respecting the illusion of freedom, we're respecting the need to teach from joy, that we're relying on shaping with, for me, it's synthesized reinforcers, not necessarily volume positive reinforcement, but negative reinforcement is somewhat ubiquitous. Just the opportunity to wander away from the teaching situation can be quite powerful, and so to leverage that as well. So that would be my second wish, I guess, is to get there the right way, to have the right priorities and to get people to appreciate what we do, because we do it so damn well. And so the onus is on us is to do it damn well. That's number one. I guess the last thing would be to be an integrative group. I think we've been working in our silos for a long time. We've been preaching to the choir. We've been huddling in our own conferences and gaining strength from each other. And I think that should continue. However, my dream is that behavior analysis is what just professionals do when they're addressing behavior, that it's not just for the chosen few, that it is what speech language pathologists do, and occupational therapists and medical doctors and physical therapists and trainers of all sorts, coaches in athletics. It's just a grand appreciation for the fact that outcomes of behavior matter. The environment shapes behavior, and we can leverage it in socially acceptable ways. So I'd like that big idea to just infect the world, and we obliterate even this thing called behavior analyst. It's just what professionals do when called in to solve problems of behavior. That's a little wild, probably not realized in my lifetime, but that's my wish.
Well, maybe in 5 to 10 years, you'll be listening to this episode, people out there in the podcast audience, and it's an episode that you might label as dripping with hope. We may have reached that place, or we may not have reached that place. But one thing we can do in the interim is be wildly effective at what we do by applying the science that we know and love. Hey,
right on.
Can you tell everyone listening, you mentioned practicalfunctionalassessment.com. You mentioned your interest in continuing the conversation and working collaboratively and continuing on these conversations. Where else can people go to find you online and get in touch and find out more about your research?
Well, the practicalfunctionalassessment.com is a free website. It's a repository for articles and data sheets and apps and all that. But my company is FTF Behavioral. Our website is ftfbc.com, FTF Behavioral Consulting. And my email is ghanley@ftfbc.com. And so if people want to link up with me or anyone in on my team for trainings or any kind of consultation, they usually go to the FTF BC website. If people want to kind of learn more about the kind of research, practice-oriented research we do, the free website is great. It has some materials there. Not designed great, let me be clear. You're going to have to click a few more times than you might want to. But nevertheless, there's some good materials there. And it was really great talking to you, Ryan. I like what you do. I appreciate what you do. And I appreciate you bringing me a little closer to the world of animal training, closer than I was before. I knew it through a few JAVA articles and some articles in a few other journals. But listening to some of your podcasts, and especially the compilation you put together, the shared values, and was really super for me to learn. And also there seemed to be an energy that I remember when I kind of first learned about the power of contingencies. And I know you have some seasoned veterans on your show, familiar with some of their names, but the energy was so strong. And just really appreciate you bringing these folks together, and appreciate the opportunity to kind of learn that my world is bigger than I sometimes recognize.
Well, that is a lot of compliments that I am grateful to receive. So thank you very much for saying all of that. I definitely am not somebody who can comment on poorly designed websites. But I've been to the practicalfunctionalassessment.com website and dived into some of the resources, and speaking for myself, found it reinforcing for myself wanting to go back there.
Okay.
And very useful as well. So we'll link to all of that in the show notes for this episode. If you didn't catch the URLs that Greg mentioned there, will be all linked in the show notes. Hey, Greg, this has been so much fun. It's been a vision of mine that this was going to happen, and it's been a vision for 5 years. So here we are, being widely effective at making things happen. So just once again, thank you so much for investing your time and hanging out with us. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Be well.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behavior geeks. There's something there for absolutely everyone, and we're looking forward to having you join the tribe. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.